Hello, and welcome to all the truth seekers that have joined us today. I'm glad that you've decided to join this online community and hope you're ready to inhale some provocative insights that will inspire and change the way you do business. My name is Mark McKelsey, and I lead the people and the projects that bring you insights, shopper trends, and next practices from Global Market Development Center and Retail Tomorrow. For the next hour, this Infocast will make your lunch hour profitable by demonstrating just how the curiosity and the power of the consumer must be at the center of your strategy. In other words, the way you've done things in the past is not the way your future success will happen. Retailers and brands more than ever must be adaptive and in constant flux in order to connect with evolving populations. So, how you respond today and to the session is vitally important. Without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm coming to you live from Colorado Springs and have Andrew McQuilkin from BHDP joining us from Cincinnati today. Today's Infocast will help you be inspired to see new store designs and layouts of retail focused that are focused on the future that involve the cultural phenomenon around self-care. Based on what the world is going through today concerning the COVID crisis, do retailers have a hope in competing with e-com players, considering that going forward and considering that BOPIS and pure play e-tailers are seeing a 30% growth rate? Well, in practice, physical retailers give consumers a more memorable, tactile, and sensory experience, as well as access to expertise, all of which is difficult to replace digitally. Conversely, there are some online purchases that consumers will always buy on their phones first, especially if they're simply looking to replenish items that they know they can't go without or need to stock up on or don't need to change brands. But there's another need by the consumer that often goes undetected by more retail store operators. When consumers need or want more than a transaction, they actually want to spend time browsing and relish the store journey. For those type of shoppers, sales can be maximized and gain incremental basket sizes beyond what any e-com or traditional consumer spends. Some of the conversation and learnings we'll cover today is about exactly how to leverage your in-store journey experts who are passionate about selling, education, and able to differentiate brand perception. The in-store experience gives retailers the chance to express their vision, their values, and their points of view. This resonates with consumers who are looking for a more thoughtful purchase, and they might want to know and hear what associates think about certain products because they work with them every day. Giving that kind of knowledge to your shoppers obviously gives physical retail stores a vital way to enhance the environment and build deep trust and loyalty. And it goes without saying that self-care today is a paramount trend. During the pandemic that the globe is seeing unravel across region by region, consumers more than ever have an inherent understanding that being preventative and proactive in their eating, lifestyle, and buying better for you products to enable that is the best thing that they can do for their personalized health regimen. There's no better place to help consumers with that journey than the physical store. Consumer healthcare is complicated, individual, and there's no silver bullet. This gives retail in-store service desks, kiosks, and concierge staff an advantage to help the shopper tailor the right programs to fit those needs. So Andrew, we're glad you're here, and tell us more about some of the things that I spoke about and what else can our viewers expect to learn about today?
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks for GMDC having me, put this all together for today. This is all actually being inspired by the Self-Care Summit. Mark had me present a couple of sessions and get a lot of feedback from the participants. And it's really, a lot of people in the room gave us a lot of inspiration for what this self-care store experience of the future would be. So we're going to present ideas around some of the research that we've done, some of the things coming out of GMDC's self-care roadmap and the insights for that. And then we've kind of brainstormed and sketched up what these things would do in store, how would they come to life. And at the end, we actually added the section here about COVID-19 and some of the things that we're seeing. And I'm anticipating that many of our questions would be around that and what might come from the future based on some of the trends we're seeing.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. So before we get started and dive in, I'd like to remind our viewers that we can take questions during or after the session by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat feature, just use the Q&A button, and we'll get to those at the end of the hour. So I'm looking forward to it. Let's get started. Back over to you, Andrew.
right, well, thank you, Mark. So this self-care shopper experience of tomorrow, again, as I indicated, where it's being informed by the self-care roadmap, the Indianapolis Selfcare Summit from the end of last year. We imagined what the drugstore was going to be. Again, we had so much feedback during our sessions and in between them that we really went back and sort of evolved this even further. And again, we planned and sketched our key findings. So I'm with an organization called BHDP Architecture and one of the partners in the firm. As Mark said, we're out of Cincinnati. Our kind of motto is that we design places and experience that inspire. And to do that, we have what we call the cognitive retail design process. It's a methodology that sort of underlays under what our clients are doing in the retail sector, but it also figures out a better way to gather the right data to be able to make informed decisions and informed designs. So this process is 8 steps. And what we did is we applied this process to the work we were doing here with GMDC. So you'll see some of it reflected in the steps that we take. Right? So again, at the Self-Care Summit, we sort of asked everybody to imagine what that shopper experience of tomorrow was going to be. So self-care. GMD actually put together a really good definition. So universally, self-care is a personal objective for individuals aspiring to look good, feel good, and live longer, and a sustainable culture trend as people assume responsibility for those outcomes in their own lives. We've looked up a lot of definitions. This one actually made the most sense to where we think the trend is heading. All right. Psychology Today has indicated that self-care is a process of proactively considering and tending to your needs and maintaining your wellness. There's also a piece of self-care that actually is taking care of others within your family. So interesting step. Why look at shopper behavior? Well, the average deductible in 2019 for an Obamacare bronze policy was nearly $1,500, while the average maximum out-of-pocket limit was just under $7,000. So according to the Health Pocket, an online health insurance shopping tool, family bronze plans have an average deductible of just under $12,200 and an average out-of-pocket of nearly $14,000. So what this did as a trend, it had people start to really look at their own care and what they can do for themselves before they started to have to dole out the minimum deductible cash. All right. So here's some of the predictions that were out there. And based on what's been going on lately in the crisis that we're in, obviously these numbers are going to get even higher than this. But by 2021, it is expected that Americans will devote 24% of their household spending on goods and services toward healthcare. It was only 12% in 1980. All right. And then in 2018 and almost in 2019, it's number 2 in 2019, but self-care as a trend has been reflected in the theming of some of the apps. So Apple has identified that this was the highest level theme in 2018 and number 2 in 2019. So people are using apps to take care of their fitness and their health. By 2030, America will have at least 40,800 unfilled posts per positions. So not only is it costing more to take care of yourself out of pocket, there's also less positions that are going to be available. All right, so we first started doing some research on pharmacy to try to understand, the needs of the pharmacist. So this was the origins that we were looking back, over 100 years ago. In fact, the upper left-hand corner, that's the pharmacy from my little hometown in Long Island, New York, called Thornhills. And again, a pharmacy back then, they were sort of an extension of a dry goods store, but all the tonics and all the medicines and all the things back then that you would needed to do some level of self-care. Nowadays we look at some of the brands that are out there, whether it's Walgreens or CVS, some of the major players, and then Target and Walmart and what they've been doing. But again, they've all been sort of evolving their journeys over time, introducing some factors like photography. They had the photographic booth for a while, but the pharmacist is still at the center, usually in the back, and they're really trying to compete from a customer journey standpoint and experience standpoint. Right. Well, Walgreens recently turned around and they started developing a smaller neighborhood health center. So the idea is that they could fit into smaller footprints, get into downtowns more because they need less square footage, and make a stronger connection to the community, and offering different types of services just even beyond the pharmacy. Not to be outdone, CVS, and their deals with developing the Minute Clinic, they've been expanding into other areas within the pharmacy for self-care. And in one area in particular is beauty. So they've gone all out to really become that beauty destination for shoppers, so that you can come in and understand and select your brands. Because we all know to look good is to feel good. But the other thing we did is we sort of looked around the world. What's been happening in pharmacy around the world? You've got a lot higher design aesthetic happening in Europe and South America when it comes to the look and feel. A lot of these stores have individual identities. They're not mass designed and mass rolled out. The pharmacist is pretty much elevated and trusted, just as it is here in the United States. In fact, one of the things that we looked at is, from a pharmacy standpoint, the pharmacist is actually more trusted than your doctor now, when it comes to people's faith in what they're recommending and what's best for you. So one of the things that was identified that GMDC was kind of putting together was trying to understand this self-care phenomenon. And they looked at 4 factors for reasons that people were getting involved in self-care. Obviously, one is prevention, which is really big right now, understanding what people are trying to do to prevent the COVID virus. Recovery. Think about the amount of people that we're finding out that are not getting hospital beds. So if you're suffering from this condition or any other condition, you are charged with getting the information that you need, getting the prescriptions that you need, and taking care of yourself at home. All right. There's one that we also talk about, which is maintenance. So not just from a prevention standpoint, but maybe you have a chronic condition, so that you're going to leverage the knowledge that you've gained and the advice that you've been given to maintain yourself at a certain level and not progress in any sort of ailment that you have. And then the fourth one, which was really interesting, is the caregiver one. It's, obviously it's the idea that you're taking care of a family member, usually an elderly parent, or for short duration, maybe a young child with some of the things that they're dealing. So mom's charged a lot of time with being the caregiver and making sure that she's making the right decisions for her family. Certainly, she's taking care of those family members at home for the most part. Interesting that came out of some of the surveys that were done and trying to understand why consumers were making decisions between going online or going in store. This was to look at shoppers who are doing both, that are buying online and buying in store, and there was some interesting data that came out of it. When you look at the areas of convenience, there were questions around that. How the assortment, the curation that's within online versus in store, around experience, right? Around price and value. And then there's always the idea of what's happening at the register from an impulse standpoint. So if you look at the areas that are experiential, which is that teal color, this is not off of 100, but if you add up all the numbers, 100 for 15%, the greatest number of sections that people were interested in why they were going to the store instead of going online was the in-store experience. So beyond all those other factors, there's a lot more weight to your brand and how it's represented as a retailer. Okay. So we can take a normal layout. This happens to be a pharmacy with a corner entrance, pretty prototypical. And you can take and decide, okay, well, there's these 4 reasons that you go and do self-care. Could you identify those reasons before people come in, rearrange the way that you allocate your product and your resources, and say, well, maybe one whole section's around recovery, or maybe one section's around maintenance, caregiving, or prevention. We kind of looked at that and said, it's a pretty Herculean thing to try to rearrange 100 years of merchandising and the way the merchants buy, and trying to get a consumer to say, well, what you've learned of how to shop a space is now totally changed, right? Because you're not just shopping for recovery. You might be shopping for 3 of these 4 things at any given time. All right. So then there's this Wellwise. It's by Shoppers Drug Mart. It's up in Canada. And they started looking at rearranging the drugstore experience around a little bit more around the shopper's needs and how they categorized it. So they had areas around mobility, right? So it's a little bit more activity based in how they broke it down, not for the reasons that you're buying. So I thought of it more of an old time pharmacy where they also have equipment, walkers, and and aids. This one actually still had these comfortable chairs that help your grandmother or grandfather get out where they lean up and forward. So they really started breaking it down into areas that made sense to what the needs are, not necessarily by prevention or caregiving, but by what you're needing from a lifestyle standpoint from the ailment itself. We recommend if we ever get back to Canada, this is one of the things that you should all check out. They have about 4 locations right now. It's very graphically heavy in terms of the branding, so it sort of hits the customer over the head when she comes in, but she gets it. Another thing that was in there is there was a whole thing in terms of over-indexing. So if you take self-care and you look at all the categories that were subcategories within it, and you kind of compare them to each other. So if you had diabetes, which is that first column of teal, what other areas or products are you also purchasing that are now over-indexing from every other transaction within the store? So it's above average in terms of your basket spend in terms of other people. So we started looking at the idea that for diabetes it's compression, ear care, eye care, foot care. These all sort of make sense, but it's an area where if you really think about making the customer journey easier, you can turn around and start to think about adjacencies a little bit different. Why do I need to go to the foot care area and then walk all the way over to skin care if I have diabetes? Is there a way that we could cross merchandising? So we said, well, let's test that idea. Let's use some parametric design, which is like the computer, a little bit of AI, and our expertise, and start thinking about how these would lay out. So we spent a lot of time brainstorming, absorbing this information, sketching up plans and even some ideas around it. And we said, okay, let's start over. So if we're going to talk about over-indexing, what over-indexes the most is diabetes, right? Then it's sleep. Well, where does sleep fit within the adjacency to diabetes and as it relates to arthritis, asthma, anxiety? Wound care is interesting. We figured it's a part of diabetes, but we made it adjacent across the center aisle, cross aisle. Obviously, there's post-op and wound care kind of overlap each other. So we said overall, this might be a more interesting way to think about how you might develop a shopping experience around those occasions. Certainly, if we're thinking about diabetes and any of these other ones, where's the overlap? And we left a little bit of space because we realized there's greeting cards, there's all these other aspects of a pharmacy that we want to make sure we're maintaining. All right. So if you actually look and broke it down, here might be the adjacencies based on some of the numbers we got from a retailer of what percentage of space in the aisles that it would take. Right. So we still left about 30 to 40% not designated for seasonal and the like. We didn't move pharmacy. If they still had photo, we didn't move it. We didn't move the register. But we thought this might be a different way to think about having the consumer drive some of the planning that's going on. With cell phones this day and everybody online, retailers used to own location. With everything in selection online now, you've got to own a better shopping experience and making it more intuitive and convenient. So that's what we were leaning on in terms of adjacency. Okay. So what we did is we experimented. We took one of the disorders, one of the occasions. We took sleep disorders. And we said, okay, based on the data coming out of the self-care roadmap and the information that GMDC was providing, and some of our own experience and research that we're going to do, how would you test this idea of designing a space just around a disorder, right? And again, my kids are in their 20s, but they still have problems doing the sleep thing. They still left over from college. So it's really interesting to see some of the things that we research and how to actually apply to my personal life. So some of the shopper needs that we were looking at when it comes to sleep disorders and the attention issues that they have, the deprivation issues that they have. Some of the things that the shoppers are needing is they're needing recommendations obviously around this. There's not a lot out there coming from pharmacies or coming from their doctors around this condition. That's usually specialists. Certainly if you have apnea, there's all these signs that they test you on to just understand before they actually run you through a sleeping test. But what are those recommendations? Is there a sleep consultant, or is there a way to connect the shopper to a sleep consultant? What's interesting is that what keeps people's attention and keeps them up and helps them stay more engaged are ideas around nature. So how does nature become part of a space? Because there's a little deprivation going on or overstimulation can really affect them. Keeping things simple, not just programmatically, but keeping the space simple. Contrast is a big way to be able to have a level of energy that these shoppers can understand. So not only to be able to read things more clearly, but to add a little bit of energy and excitement to a space. Morning light, we are programmed as human beings to be able to leverage more morning light to wake us up and to keep us up. So, think about the lighting levels and the color of the lighting, the full spectrum lighting. That's available now. And is that something that we could put within the spaces? Obviously, clear signage. And we also know oxygen. Not that we're going to pump spaces through oxygen, like the legend or the lore they have around casinos, where they pump oxygen in that night to keep people up. But whatever we can do to think about what their needs are going to be and how does that translate into space. We talked about technologies. Again, a lot of this is coming out of the brainstorming we did at the Self-Care Summit in these sessions that we had. We were just asking the participants to spend time with us, writing down on cards, putting these information together. So this is, again, like really compiling the stuff. We actually discussed everybody's answers and sort of prioritized them into top 8 for each of these sections. So again, the self-care apps, there's already sleep apps out there available. Your iWatch will run all night long and tell you how well you slept. And again, it will help people to try different things, different nights to see which one works for them. Certainly checkout options. There's a lot less engagement that people who are sleepy are going to want. Maybe they're a little more cranky. But the idea is that what are those options that you can do to make it easier for them to get it out? Kiosks, providing that information for them to connect beyond the store. Digital signage to get their attention right where they are. The idea that you have, these cases now that are out there where you can, put the product right where they're looking. Again, because of their attention span and because they have the ability to then, get the brand messages right at the decision-making point. Smart carts are a great idea. Being able to have information right at your fingertips if you're in the grocery store, or if there's carts or baskets that can have this sort of technology attached to it, or talk to your phone even. Wearable tech, AR. There are companies right now who are developing the idea that with some markers within the store, you can use an AR app to hold up in front of an aisle, be searching for what's on your grocery list, and it can tell you where in the aisle to find it. The ease of shopping, intuitive, simplifying their whole journey here. And then obviously a big introduction in the last 2 years around smart shelves. Again, similar to the digital signage that would be on cases, how do you provide the information they need when they need it? We all thought these had influences on helping the customer dealing with a sleep disorder. Okay. So sleep disorders, really interesting facts coming out of the information that is able to be presented by GMDC. So children who fall short by just 1 hour per night have a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes as they get older. That's a pretty significant thing to think about, just a single hour. So if you're child is not getting, 8 to 9 hours sleep a night, if the earlier they start having shorter, the more likely they are to develop type 2 diabetes, right? So you can see how a lot of these occasions are sort of connected. Understanding that people with apnea are more likely to develop other conditions that then also fit within all the self-care. I'm speaking from my own experience. So people with general sleep disorders, some of the top line things we researched, they have difficulty staying asleep or falling asleep. Obviously, they have daytime fatigue. They have a strong urge to take naps. They are irritable or have anxiety, or both. They have a lack of concentration. So if you think about signage and contrast and putting messages right where they're at, that's something to think about in terms of design solutions. They suffer from depression. Natural daylight, what we talked about, is a good thing for that. They have weight gain, right? You actually lose weight when you sleep more. One, I assume, because you're not eating. And the other one, because your body is able to deal with all the calories that you're taking in better. You're not under a stress environment where your body is reacting to, the sort of ingrained stress things we had when we were hunter-gatherers. It's also impaired performance. All right. And again, we looked into what causes sleep disorders, allergies, respiratory problems, all these issues that really delve deep. So think about chronic pain. So you can have sleep disorders because you're actually dealing with a chronic pain issue, which is another one of the occasions. So some of this causes sleep disorders. Most of these all causes some, and sometimes sleep disorders actually reflect back on some of these conditions and make them worse. So here's some of the things they recommend, that they eat more vegetables and fish, right? So if you were going to design a space around this, how would you connect it back to the layout? Reduce your sugar, reduce stress and anxiety by exercising, regular sleep schedule, drinking less before bedtime, limit evening caffeine, decrease tobacco and alcohol, that makes sense, and lower your carbohydrate meals, a little more of a protein diet. All right. So again, this is all part of the way we approach cognitive retail, is how do you take all this research and data and start to think about what it means for design? So here's some things we thought about. We brainstormed in the room, we did our research on. From an ADA issue, this is not necessarily viable, but how can you make the journey a little bit more challenging? How do you take the stairs? Something really weird we found out, if you push your nose, you actually wake yourself up more. Yeah, I don't know why, but there's research papers we found on it, and they proved the case. We talked about natural daylight helping you. Chewing gum, keeps you awake. Interesting about forcing yourself to do multitasks, keeps your brain moving in multiple ways, so then it keeps you up. The other thing too is, if you are listening to music you like, that'll keep you up. I'm not talking music you go to sleep by, but if you have the right tune that gets your feet tapping, well, again, that's something we control within the environment. Drinking more water, and again, some other thing we found, cat videos keep people up. Who knew? So, in using the self-care roadmap, which is this tool that GMDC has online for its members, the ability to go through and tap on all these occasions, understand different aspects about it, whether it's basket size or condition insights, and then kind of understand why you're in the store to begin with, or why you're buying it to begin with, whether you're maintaining or recovering. You can spin these wheels and it can pop out information that makes a lot of sense, to be able to inform yourself for buying or for allocating space. So in the sleep one, it was interesting to see where it over-indexed, right, in vitamins and diet nutrition. Right, it was interesting to see where the basket size was. All right. Hydration obviously is something that's recommended, and they do over-index in hydration. Sometimes your allergies are keeping you up, so we think there's a connection there. And then when it came to basket size, it was really interesting to see some of the things that were happening in the space. And one of the things that was interesting too is a lot of the self-care occasions that we're in, there was a lot of over-indexing and greeting cards. So I assume if you are taking care of somebody else, or you're looking to give someone a pick-me-up, I assume that's why greeting cards are usually over-indexing in the self-care world, because you're trying to make people feel better as part of it. So we took and started to understand the planning end of it. We started to break down kind of how this area might work, and we said, you know, maybe we make a left-handed version of this, where we take things that over-index, like dietary, cards, food and snacks, put the carbohydrates maybe a little bit further back, make them walk for it, give them some more exercise. But again, this is some of the things that started to generate around that in terms of how you might allocate the space and lay it out. So we turned around and we said, well, let's take this idea of what they're looking for in terms of sleep, and let's take the current formats that we've been seeing and introduce elements to the design that would help somebody with sleep disorders. So we sketched up and said, okay, maybe the spaces have a clear story. The idea that we can pull more natural daylight. Maybe there's skylights over each of the sections and around the perimeter. So again, add more natural daylight. Those skylights could have a sort of a graphic element to the face of them to be able to add signage to make it clearer for them to understand which area to go to. We talked about contrast. So maybe the floor has a contrasted pattern, again, to add energy to the space. We think vistas are important, maybe adding some kinetic energy with some of the vistas, maybe giving people the ability to tap into Bluetooth their own music to their headsets, or making sure that the music you have within your space is more upbeat. It has to be a little more universal. And so some of the things that we started to look at, so well, we think this is possible. You can take one of these disorders, these ailments, and you can design a space around. All right. So then we said, okay, what about one that's a little more complicated? What about anxiety? Right? 12% of millennials have officially been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, which is nearly double the percentage of baby boomers. So think about that, the stress that we're putting these younger generations. And I could just imagine what Gen Y is going through right now with the coronavirus. But again, this is clinically diagnosed, and it has so many other things that it does for individuals when you look at the effect of having anxiety. So you're looking at 12% of the population in the US before our current crisis had anxiety disorders. So people with general anxiety disorders, anxiety can cause heart disease. It obviously can cause stomach problems. It exacerbates arthritis and migraines. Interesting, your allergies have an effect and a reverse effect. Because you're messing with your immune system in anxiety disorders, you can cause your allergies to get out of control. It causes thyroid disease. You're 4 times more likely to have high blood pressure. And obviously it weakens your immune system, which again causes a lot of other things that you see up above. So a very powerful disorder in terms of its effect. Right? So we looked into anxiety reducing design. We got some feedback from the groups that we did in the session around this, but we also went back and did our design. So part of what we looked at anxiety is this idea around compartmentalization. You don't want to come in and see a huge, vast array of things. You don't want to overwhelm somebody who's dealing with anxiety disorders. You want to be able to compartmentalize their vista and their view, keep it simple, okay? Interestingly enough, you want to round corners. You want to soften the space. You don't want it to feel too harsh or too angular. Light levels are important. It isn't necessarily super bright light, but it's the idea that there might be light that bounces around the space more. Minimalism, keeping things super simple. Biophilic design. That image, by the way, is of an Apple store, where they have sort of this solarium facing the parking lot. And in it, they put trees in. So if you can put real natural materials in, plants, or even emulate, what you find in nature in the design, that actually has a very common effect on people. There's a piece too that a lot of people dealing with anxiety are going to have avoidance issues. So, when you're designing spaces or breaking it down into departments, how do you turn around and understand that this is what she might be going through? and how do you let her just absorb one piece at a time? The other thing that they're looking for is order. We called it purpose, but everything has a place. Disarray or chaos, it really adds to their condition. So having a store that's maintained, clean, and organized. And then the other piece of this is this idea of natural colors, not too bright, not too much energy. Again, you don't want to overstimulate them. We looked at the over-indexing, where that would happen within anxiety, and try to understand those parts and pieces, right? We turned around and looked at the basket sizes and understand what parts and pieces were over-indexing in the basket, not just within the category, but outside the category as well. Interesting showing up was tobacco. Again, people who have anxiety disorders sometimes rely on tobacco. All right. We looked at, again, the technology trends. They were very similar to the technology trends. But again, a lot of times they don't like dealing with people. So maybe an innocuous robot might be something that would really help them, avoid the interaction, because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to reduce the amount of stimulation they're getting. Okay. So we looked at that layout. We turned around and tried to understand what the parts and pieces were. And then we said, okay, how would this experience change or adapt for anxiety? So we actually did a little bit more compartmentalization within the design. We try to look at how to, even on some of the divides that we would do at the end of gondolas, instead of doing the end of gondolas, maybe the architecture comes down. Maybe there's a bit of kiosk or data or a way just to have them singularly focused on a 4-foot section. And so we looked and said, okay, what are those parts and pieces? Maybe anything that's high energy or things that you want to do in terms of, seasonal, maybe it's further at the back. We call those the power zones. Maybe the sections that we do along the side, think of as need zones, the information caps. Maybe there's a lot more self-service cash wraps. You don't have to deal with the attendant, but it's intuitive, to be able to come up to that kiosk and check out. All right. We think the vistas are important to talk about the brand, but keep it soothing and neutral. Maybe the ceiling's wood. All right. And you could have a little bit of tech, but we think tech is more on the shop on the shelf level, so they can interact with some sort of iPad about this particular product they want more information on. But you can see even the vista is broken down within here, so that you're trying to absorb the whole long space at one time. All right, so then we said, okay, can we apply some of these learnings to the grocery world, to the supermarket? So doing our research and understanding, the brands and their origin, because I did it for the pharmacy. The upper left-hand corner is my grocery store growing up. It was called Bohack, really a bare bones value retailer, but they were in the local downtowns on Long Island. So it's not until the late 1950s and early 1960s that the first supermarket pharmacies were opened. In fact, it was H.E. Butt, which is now H.E.B., Kroger, and Safeway, were the earliest pioneers of thinking about self-care pharmacy and bringing it into the supermarket. So here's some of what we see right now, right? So you understand that, some of them have developed their own pharmacies. Others still bring in, the outside expert, the independent pharmacy companies like CVS into Target. They look like they're all part of the store, so they belong to the brand. So, Target CVS still is with, the way Target does its fonts and its colorways. The PMS color actually is pretty close between CVS and Target. So, it keeps it brand right for both. So we said, okay, well, it's a segment of the store. It usually has a little bit of a drop up. Now they're developing clinics. And so we looked at, those layouts and the spaces adjacent to it and said, okay, if it was by the reasons that you're going, maybe it looks like that, but we know that's not really going to work for the shopper or the merchants. So we overlaid on top of that, all the parts and pieces and how they might go within the space. We said there might be a bigger adjacency to where we think there's a lot of questions. So we talked to a few pharmacists and asked, based on these occasions, what are people asking the most about? And diabetes is one of the ones, and wound care is one of the ones, and pain relief is one of the ones that they're really talking a lot about. So how do you build those adjacencies to the person who can give you the information as well? All right. And so that might, how that all might break down in terms of some of the percentage we got from one of the retailers. The interesting thing is the clinic looks totally different than the pharmacy a lot of times. So we said, there's an opportunity here at minimum to kind of make sure the self-care area has one point of view or one look that all marries underneath the brand of the supermarket. Right? And then we turned around and we started looking at what else was out there, the wellness clinics, some of the things that people are doing in this area. We started to understand, who some of the major players are in terms of design. Supermarkets are bringing in restaurants. There's a lot of high-end ones going around internationally. There's even some small formats being developed by Kroger and some of the other brands on the East Coast. Idealee's on the bottom. It's very experiential, right? So we looked at the technology trends, right? Very similar. We looked at, who's doing something different around self-care when it comes to the supermarket. Obviously, Walmart pulled out Walmart Health, and they looked at dentistry and some of the other things that go in, so their own sort of little medical center or self-care center to be able to attach people to the experts. We also said that there's a trend out there that the front end of the store is maybe pulling back, that you're turning around and seeing less registers through technology. We know that with what's going on right now with COVID, there might be something happening here where the registers are going to have to be further apart moving forward. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we said, well, what if you took all of self-care, it's such a major trend, and now being exacerbated by what's going on in the crisis? Do you turn around and maybe you pull all self-care to the front of the store, maybe where the registers used to be, the prime real estate, right? Do you still maybe have your two front entrances? You pull pharma, maybe pharma's a drive up at the front of the store now, and you're really communicating about self-care. You move the registers off to the side, you still build the clinic in the middle. You talk about self-care. You have information between the clinic and the pharmacy like you do now, but maybe they feel more united, right? You'd break it down into the different aspects of what was normally within the area. So we said, okay, what could that be? So we turned around and said, well, maybe beauty has a bigger place within this. Think of cosmetics within a department store. This cosmetics in the department store is when you first come in. It's high margin area, right? It's not about registers. It's about beauty. So maybe that's one of the sides on either side of the pharmacy. The pharmacy itself, will have outside access. Maybe there's some daylight coming in to keep it more fresh, a little less clinical, right? There's a community zone aspect to it. And again, how do you marry in, say, an info kiosk that still gives a sense of privacy? So we even thought beyond this, maybe there's a little more privacy we can do. Maybe it's more a table height, one that you look down on so that you can put personal information and nobody can see you. So we said, okay, well, what would this mean for anxiety? So we went through the same process. What are some of the things that we see out there from a technology standpoint that would benefit those who are dealing with anxiety? We're starting to see a lot of this now push forward with what's going on. But 24-hour pickup, mobile checkout, digital health. We think the signage, the smart carts are still important. Pickup in the store, which we've seen big numbers in terms of what our retailers are telling us is coming out. Shop online, pick up in the store. Smaller formats might be coming. It might be more distribution oriented for some of these smaller formats, experiential from the outside. And then this idea of a personal shopper, somebody to help you. As companies are shutting down service areas, they're taking those people and putting them out on the floor, not just to clean and disinfect, but to also give more advice to the customers to help them shop. So COVID-19. So we're seeing is shopper trends that we're seeing is, this idea around hygiene is now everybody has OCD. Everybody is starting to figure out that I'm going to need to do whatever I can from a self-care standpoint to prevent me and my family from getting this virus. And so we've seen it explode off the shelves. We've seen whole companies that were doing distilleries change into doing hand sanitizer because of the demand going way up. We've seen people buy freezers and then stockpile frozen meats and frozen vegetables. So everybody's stockpiling this stuff. You can't go into Home Depot or Lowe's and buy a freezer at the moment, right? Because everybody's getting one, they're getting it up and running, and they're stockpiling it. Drive-through is becoming really popular, certainly in pharmacy. People that I know that would normally go in are now using the drive-up. When there used to be all these face-to-face actions, they're not happening anymore. Retailers realize their guests, they're uncomfortable about it. You don't want, you have to be less than 6 feet to actually have a conversation with your butcher. So the butcher's still cutting stuff up, but they're packaging it. which is what you see on the bottom underneath that. Packaged fish right now, and two of the retailers we talked to, for some reason we know it's Lent, but it is flying off the shelves. Because one reason is because now it's packaged, you know what you're paying for it. So you don't have to ask the butcher for, how big a cut. You know the actual price you're going to pay. The other thing too is they can wipe down the package. So if anybody else has touched it, they can disinfect the package before they use it. We're seeing stuff on brand choices. One retailer turned around the other day and said, Andrew, if it's not on the shelf, we're going to continue to buy it. If it's still on the shelf, there's no reason for us to buy it anymore. Right? Even under the crisis, our shoppers are not buying it. And then from an interesting one that he mentioned is there's some interesting policing going on. Customers are pointing out people who are not maintaining social distance. And they're going up to their associates and say, can you stop this person from getting close to me or my family? So you're asking people who are getting paid, 13 to 15 bucks an hour now to police the store and the social distancing. That's not solved yet. So we're going to have to figure out how you do that when we're talking about the aisles. And then we looked at retailer trends that are going on. How are retailers adjusting to this crisis from the shopper needs and some of their needs? So if you had pickup in the store, it is taken off like no tomorrow. We know there was a huge uptick for a couple of weeks. It's leveling off a little bit, but it's still a major factor. Certainly when online delivery doesn't have what you need, people are going to the store. And one of my designers turned around, and the way they work it now is your job as the driver is to open up your trunk for the associate. So all they touch is the bag. They don't touch your car. We've seen senior hours. This is an image of queuing tape, so people know where to stand. That's been happening. There's a Meijer local to us that's put and marked, I've seen a sign, every 6 square in the floor. One retailer is closing every other register so that there's a distance between them. We know that sneeze guards are really big right now, and people are using massive efforts to install it. Talking to one of the heads of design for one of the big chains, that's all his job right now is to make sure that it gets retrofitted into each one. In fact, he drew a sketch that made it to the internet. So people are using his sketch everywhere to think about how to develop plexiglass for the registers. A lot of retailers are now turning more to social media. So if they had a social media platform, it's a great way to still leverage and stay in touch with their guests, certainly if they're not coming into the store. Everything is now self-service. So you can't get somebody to make you flowers or anybody in the flower department, but they are pre-making and pre-packaging stuff for that. And then they've discontinued things like lottery sales and bottle returns. So somebody's gonna have to eventually figure out how to do this bottle return thing. And then one of the things we did in this session, we said, okay, let's go even bigger. Let's talk about how this overall thing could affect an entire supermarket. If the commodity thing is something that we said is being affected more and more online, and people are now turning to that even more under the current situation, how do you get people to feel more about the expertise and the experiences that you can offer? And we think this is actually going to be more important moving forward as we draw people back to the retail experience. So this was a sketch that was done by one of the retailers in one of the sessions we did at the Selfcare Summit. And we said, okay, so actually at the summit, I took all the information and we actually sketched it live at the summit on a side table. People are coming up and giving feedback. A lot of people really like the idea of the pharmacy or the self-care at the front. So we kept it there, but we turned the store, we flipped the middle to the sides and the sides to the middle. So normally when you walk around the store, you're going to be able to, touch all your key categories in terms of service departments. Well, if that's going to be something that people are going to be less likely to do, how do you get them to re-engage it? So we said, okay, so maybe it's self-care and all the experiential elements, and then we up it a little bit more like an Eataly to draw people back. How does everything else then go around it? Maybe there's still the idea that you can pull in some other areas like dental, some wellness classes, maybe even some exercise classes. People aren't going to want to go to 5 or 6 different things to meet their self-care needs. How do you make it all a little bit more one-stop for them, into a space that they trust? So we said, well, what if the whole store changed? Maybe the outside of the store needs to change. If pickup is going to be here to stay, Instead of just going out into the middle of the parking lot, maybe the front of the store changes and you're going to pick up at the front, right? Maybe the pharmacy, you can see the pharmacy in the background, the entrances. Maybe there's a pickup door that's just part of the facade. And this stuff we started developing in September, October, November. And we've made some tweaks to it recently with what's going on. Here's that center core experience. How do you still talk about specialties in a way that, you know, it's a little more self-serve, but still experiential? You know, one of the things that's going to happen in the restaurant world, and we think even within the food offerings within a supermarket, spacing between tables might be something that's still going to happen. So how do you still keep parties 6 feet or more apart? You know, this is happening in higher ed now. People are drawing circles around desks. So I think it might be something a little bit more permanent, or at least here for a little while. And based on some of the sketches that we did, we went to a board meeting for GMDC out in California, and I drove to Woodland Hills. And here's this building that was just about to open, and it had all these drive-up spots right at the curb, right at the front with its own entry. So this is the Amazon supermarket. It wasn't open yet. There were 2 guards, you know, securing the space outside. It should be open obviously now, but I'm interested to see what they've done in terms of understanding what the needs of their shopper was, who's an online and in-store shopper, and how they might address some of the changing needs with going on right now with the virus. So with that said, I want to thank you all for giving us the opportunity to kind of show you pretty fast paced here, some of the things we've been working on and thinking about. We're thinking about more stuff right now, but I give it back to Mark.
Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being on our Education Council and leading a lot of these type of projects for GMDC. We really appreciate it. And your time today to put together this tailored Infocast for the past hour. It's interesting, Andrew, because a couple questions have come through. One of our viewers has said, hey, they're seeing a huge spike in the sexual wellness area during the COVID-19 inside their store. And is it possible that at some point we could begin to build diagrams in regards to what those new sections could look like? And again, I've seen all the Facebook memes in regards to, you know, we call them the millennials, and in 9 months we'll see a baby boom. We'll call them the coronials. It's no surprise, but not something that we were prepared to talk about today, but I think a really interesting comment by one of our viewers.
Well, again, we're not going to talk about it, but the idea that there was advice given through some of the government agencies that said, you know, if you're going to battle depression, this is something that they're recommending.
Yeah, really interesting. Hey, we have a couple more questions. Let me go ahead and get to those. Our first one is, with anxiety now a global norm, do you have any predictions on what the COVID-19 trends you mentioned that will remain long-term and even become permanent?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mentioned the areas of like hygiene, social distancing. So, you know, this whole idea of the front end, I mentioned it a little bit, but the idea that we're going to have to reevaluate how people check out of a store. You know, you're still going to have, or trying to get back a certain amount of volume. Right now, the grocery stores are over volumed with what's been going on. But our register is going to be now 8 feet apart. You know, are you going to get rid of the tandem and make the tandems 8 feet apart? Are you going to offer a lot more self-checkout technologies, whether it's kiosks or apps? Again, because if a lot of people stick around with this anxiety, their behaviors are going to be permanently changed.
Some of the other Infocasts I've been attending this week and last week, and the IHL was reporting that retailers are saying there's an unbudgeted $15 billion spend in the back half of the year just to transform the front end and the checkout stands. That Apple Pay will suddenly become a much more norm for many of these retailers because the trend for the consumers not to touch anything but the product that they buy could be a long-lasting effect and permanent consumer behavior in the future, knowing that this could happen again. So be very interesting, and a lot of technology companies should be ramping up and anticipating those phone calls once this crisis is over.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to the pharmacy and I'm doing exactly that. I will not swipe my credit card. What's bugging me is I have to sign for it. So I take the hand sanitizer, I wipe the pen, and then I sign for it. And if I push a button, I'm using the hand sanitizer right after. But it's affecting the way I'm doing things. I'm using this a whole lot more.
Interesting. Hey, one more question, and I think we're at the top of our hour, Andrew. Another question, you discussed the effects on the shopper and the retailer space, but what about the manufacturer and supplier? How might they be affected long term?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. You know what, I was talking to one of the East Coast grocers the other day, and he basically said, and I'll put it back to the fact that if it's still on the shelf, don't buy it anymore. I think a lot of manufacturers are going to have to look at the breadth of what they've been supplying and try to get more SKUs in their section within the space. You know, let's say they have 10. Well, in this crisis, maybe only 5 or 6 have been selling it. So I think manufacturers going to have to realize, you know, these brands that the other brands that you had added or market share wise, you think you were trying to own the shelf more, maybe you're just manufacturing 5 or 6 of those now, not all 10. I think that might be something to be considered. You know, people, if it's run out, I think customers are trying other brands that are available. You might be able to switch some brand loyalties across brands, but I think every manufacturer's got to figure out that you got to add a little bit more, you're going to have to edit more because you're going to realize that there's stuff on the shelf. One of the ones told me he was told that there were still bottles of water in one of his stores. So he went there and there were bottles of water. It was one single brand. It was Dasani. And he said, well, why is nobody buying it? And he said his customers don't like the taste of it. So in this crisis, they would rather you drink tap water than, hopefully nobody from Dasani's on. But the idea is they're helping point out the obvious to people now in their buying decisions.
Well, thanks again, Andrew. Ann Boyles, thank you for your compliments on the Q&A. We're glad to be able to bring this Infocast and also glad that you've been able to have access to this presentation. That being said, thanks again, Andrew. We appreciate your time today. And to go back to our viewers, if this is your first time experiencing a GMDC Infocast, I'd like to make sure that you're aware that this session and all previous Infocast events can be viewed on the archive tab on gmdcconnect.org, along with a schedule to register for a future Infocast. We're in the midst of changing our entire calendar to make it more COVID-19 relevant, and look for some future Infocasts that will be coming up very soon in regards to the impact on Amazon, as well as what does coronavirus mean for other retail stores, and that will be hosted by Kearney coming up fairly soon as well. So some of the schedule that you see today will be moving around. Just please keep coming back to gmdc.org and check our schedule. I'd also like to encourage to get involved with GMDC Retail tomorrow and become a member. Today's Infocast is a small sample of what members have access to. GMDC is a nonprofit retail-owned association that helps companies connect people to growth and opportunity in the general merchandise, health, beauty, wellness, and self-care industries. For more information, please contact me at markm@gmdc.org, and I'd love to help you find opportunities to get your company exposed to high-profile executives and decision makers, especially during the crisis. If you're having trouble making some of those connections, please call me. We have a member service team that would love to help you out with that. Thanks for joining us today. We hope the rest of your week is as productive and safe as this hour has been virtually, and please continue to wash your hands. Take care.